We are in the closing weeks of this course, and I begin by situating where we are in the larger plan of the argument. Today, I hope to complete the discussion of democracy, to go on to a brief conversation about education, and then, if possible, even to begin some remarks about the relation of the national alternatives that have been our main concern to the alternative forms of globalization. I do want to preserve time at the end of the course for the discussion of ideas, and in particular, three sets of ideas, that is, ideas that are not narrowly institutional. First, ideas about how to think about structural change, structural discontinuity, and structural alternatives in history. The social theoretical foundations of a programmatic argument like this one. Second, ideas about agency, intimately related to those ideas about structure and structural change. How should we think about the political and social agents of alternatives such as the ones that we have been considering in the course? And third and finally, ideas about ideals, the normative conception, the ideal vision that has animated these programmatic arguments. And in particular, the great theme of the enhancement of agency, or of what from time to time I've called deep freedom. And then it would be good to reserve one class just to discuss general themes in the course, particularly as provoked by the papers that you will be writing. Now then, democracy. I remind you of the 5 sets of institutional innovations with which I have tried to give content to the idea of a high-energy democracy. A high-energy democracy is defined in this view as a democracy that can master the structure of society, diminish the dependence of change on crisis, and therefore overthrow the rule of the living by the dead. Such a project requires, according to the argument that I outlined last week, a series of overlapping institutional innovations. I begin simply by recalling what they are, the main families of innovations. First, there are innovations that have to do with the raising of the temperature of politics, that is to say, the level of organized popular engagement in political life, with the intention of rejecting the choice, the false choice, as I argued, between a politics that is cold and institutional and a politics that is hot but anti-institutional or extra-institutional, such as a populist Caesarism. The second set of innovations has to do with the hastening of the pace of politics. If power is fragmented, as it should be, we should expect impasses to arise among different parts of the state. But then the object should be to resolve those impasses quickly and to resolve them through the engagement of the general electorate by anticipated elections or by comprehensive programmatic plebiscites and referendums. And in this way, we insist on distinguishing the liberal principle of the fragmentation of power from the conservative principle of the slowing down of politics, denying that they are naturally and necessarily connected. The third set of innovations has to do with the relation between initiative undertaken by the central government, which would be the federal government in a federal system, or the national government in a unitary state, and local governments, the other parts of the federation in a federal system, or the local authorities in a unitary state. And the conventional view, as you know, is that there is a simple inverse relation between power to the center and power to the periphery. What one gains, the other loses. And this thesis I have also rejected, claiming in this argument that we can have more of both. We can do so by tapping the experimentalist potential of a federal system, or by combining in a unitary state strong initiative by the central government with radical devolution. And there are different ways of achieving this combination. The most radical form, and the most radical and the most interesting of this combination, is one in which we relax the assumption that all parts of the country should enjoy uniformly and simultaneously the same prerogative of deviation, and we allow parts of a country under certain conditions to apply for a opportunity for very wide divergence from the generally prevailing solutions. And the aim of this dialectic between strong central initiative and divergence is to allow a society, as it proceeds in a certain direction, to hedge its bets and to make it possible for parts of itself to create counter models of the national future. These models will not be eloquent, they will not be persuasive and transformative if they are simply doctrines. They must be embodied in tangible examples, and these examples can then be presented to the country as alternative images of its future. The fourth set of innovations is the fourth and fifth are innovations that I addressed only at the very end of class last week, and they deserve some more comment. So the fourth set of innovations has to do with the attempt to address a particular problem of these societies. All contemporary societies continue to be class societies. And even if we imagine this deepening of democracy that is presaged by these five sets of institutional innovations, we can imagine that the class character of society will persist for some time. And class society is, of course, an enemy of democracy. It is the denial of a fundamental promise of democracy, because it says that there's an entrenched structure of social division and hierarchy that powerfully shapes the life chances of individuals, especially through the hereditary transmission of differential economic and educational opportunity through the family. So in these class societies, a recurrent problem is the existence of groups, classes or fragments of classes or communities that find themselves caught in a circumstance of disadvantage or exclusion from which they are unable to escape by the forms of collective economic, social, and political action that are available to them. And therefore, under this view, the state should be organized and equipped to come to the rescue of these groups and to liberate them from this circumstance of inescapable disadvantage and exclusion. So these are circumstances in which the evil to be addressed is localized in particular areas of social practice or organizations affecting particular groups. It's not a universal problem of society. But although the evil is localized, it is also structural. That is, it has to do with the arrangements of the economy and the society, and the arrangements that are conformed or reinforced by the laws. And it seems that under the existing constitutional forms, this very narrow repertory of live constitutional options that exist in the contemporary world, there is no power in the state specifically designed, financed, equipped, and legitimated to perform this rescue operation, addressing an evil that is both localized and structural. So what happens? I gave the example of a notable development in American law beginning in the closing decades of the 20th century. So there has been an ambitious post-formalist conception of law that represents law in the language of impersonal policy and principle. That is to say, in the language of ideals. It is a systematizing and idealizing representation of law. And one of the consequences of this systematic idealization of law in the vocabulary of impersonal policy and principle is to make possible a contradiction, a tension between what the law is understood to promise and the character of actual social life, of particular social practices and arrangements in corners of society. And then the mere recognition and settlement of adjudicated disputes among individual right holders, which is the concern of the traditional judiciary, the adjudication as traditionally understood, is not enough to solve this problem because it's a structural problem and it requires structural solutions. So there's no power in the state, for example, in the American state, because we're taking the example of the United States, that is appropriate for this. There are consequential objections for the executive, the legislature, or the judiciary to do it. So there is no power in the state designed, equipped, and legitimated to do this work. But it is a work that seems to be required by the idealizing interpretation of the law. So then what happens? What happens is that the power in the state that wants to do it does it and stretches the limits of institutional propriety, the propriety of its role. So in the United States, that was the federal judiciary, at least in the historical period in which the liberals or progressives control the appointments to the federal judiciary. So they did it. Now, you ask, why did they do it? And the answer is they did because they wanted to do it. Legitimated by this idealizing interpretation of the law, but at the cost of stretching the limits of the understandings of their role as judges. And the stretch took the form of what came to be described in American law as structural injunctions or complex enforcement. So they intervened in prisons or mental asylums or school systems, and occasionally even took them over and delegated their management to independent authorities and even seized budgetary resources. So this was a violent stretching of the traditional judicial role, authorized by this ambitious, idealizing interpretation of the law. So they could have gone on. Why did they stop where they stopped? Now, they could have gone on in two senses. They could have gone on reaching further and further into the structural background of the evils that they were addressing. Because one evil has a cause, and that cause is caused by another cause, and then it's like a thread that you begin to unravel as you penetrate further and further into the background of social life. And they could have gone on in another sense by proceeding from these relatively marginal institutions like schools or prisons to institutions that were more central to the system of power and of production. They could have gone on, but they didn't go on. They didn't go on because they ran out of power. So from a purely legal standpoint, the development of this complex enforcement, these structural injunctions, could have been understood as an ad hoc splitting of the difference between two legal ideas. So the first idea is, if the law gives you a mandate to do something, in this case to resolve a contradiction between its ideals and what happens in practical social life, implement the mandate. Even if you have to implement it, you must stretch the limits of institutional propriety, of the role, in this case, of the role of judges. That's one idea. The opposite idea is do only what the proper understanding of the judicial role, in this case, authorizes. So no mandate should be implemented except under the constraints of institutional propriety. So these are two incompatible ideas. And one way to understand the actual historical evolution of the practice of complex enforcement or structural injunctions is it was just an arbitrary splitting of this contrast, a compromise between these two incompatible ideas. And the line of adjustment, the compromise, is determined ad hoc by the realities of power. In the closing decades of the 20th century in the United States, a significant faction of the American progressives had given up on attempting to obtain their agenda from the people. And they had embarked on the project of circumventing political politics by judicial politics. And to some extent, the development of complex enforcement was part of that. But of course, this whole project was undermined to the extent that they lost control of the agenda of the judicial appointments, the actual composition of the federal judiciary. Now, thinking ahead, what could you say then about this? So you could say, in the actual states that exist in the world, in which there's no part of the state that is designed, equipped, and legitimated to do this work that is structural or localized, what will happen and should happen is that whoever can do it and wants to do it in the state does it so long as he can. Then he runs out of power. But then there has to be a second stage in which you create ex post, retrospectively, the branch of government explicitly designed, financed, equipped, and legitimated to do this work. So the task comes first, the role comes later. That's what generally happens in the world, because the world is organized to reproduce itself. So if there's a new transformative task, there's never any available role entirely adequate to it. So the task comes first and the role is created later. Be another branch of the state. So let's say that's the fourth set of innovations. And its immediate object is to attack this contradiction between democracy and class society. The fifth set of innovations are the innovations intended to enhance the institutions of representative democracy with aspects of direct or participatory democracy. So we had this conversation before. The left at different moments in modern history proposed overcoming representative democracy and replacing it with a conciliar, direct, participatory democracy. And this never worked, this intended replacement. In practice, it was never more than a brief interlude, being replaced either by the reinstatement of the conventional forms of representative democracy or by some outright authoritarian system, in which the state would be controlled by an elite claiming to speak on behalf of the popular majority. But the failure of this attempt to achieve direct and participatory democracy as a substitution of representative democracy does not impugn the feasibility or desirability of the enhancement of representative democracy by elements of direct or participatory democracy. And that attempt would not be subject to the same insuperable problems of the replacement effort. And this enhancement of representative democracy by elements of participatory democracy could happen in two ways: from the bottom up, through the engagement of society at the grassroots level in the work of government, of the direction of power and the formulation of policy, for example, through participatory budgeting, one of the most familiar examples. Or from the top down, by the expansion of the direct involvement of the citizens, of the electorate, through referendums and plebiscites and other constitutional devices of the same kind. So those are the 5 sets of innovations. And once again, the idea is this is not a system. It's not like it's an indivisible package. The different parts of this direction reinforce each other and limit each other, so you begin wherever you can begin. So, for example, I made the empirical claim in the United States that one of the most appealing and feasible places to begin might be the re-energizing of American federalism, because it is a cause that would have wide appeal to different parts of American society and American politics. And then you can imagine a succession of steps. And at the very end would be the changes most difficult to bring about in the United States, which would be the changes having to do with the central constitutional arrangements, the actual setup of the government, given the sanctity of the Constitution in the United States and the cult of the Constitution. So it's not a system, it's a process of combined and uneven development. And the particular description that I proposed of the 5 set of arrangements was at this arbitrary point of a middle distance from what now exists. So I could have described them so they would be closer to what now exists or further away from what exists. But as I observed very early in the course, from the standpoint of conceptual clarification, it is often most useful to take this middle distance. And when I said that, I also pointed out that the middle distance is likely to be inconvenient in transformative practice or political persuasion, because the proposals at the middle distance are likely to seem too far away from what exists to be feasible, but not far away enough to arouse enthusiasm. And that is why, in the language of political persuasion, we might characteristically reject this middle distance and combine the very close to the very remote, the practical and the prophetic, which is part of the ambition of the language of political persuasion. So let me stop there, and you have the idea of this. So just one more thing to say. So I'm treating this domain of the reorganization of politics as just one domain of institutional transformation among others. But it is a domain that enjoys a certain primacy over the others, just in this sense that the political institutions determine the making of the laws. And therefore, they determine the conditions under which transformation can occur in all the other domains. And that's the sense in which the transformation of politics, the deepening of democracy, enjoys a certain primacy over all the other domains. That's the extraordinary significance of these changes in comparison to many of the others that we have explored earlier in the course. So would someone like to comment about this, about the character of this institutional program or some part of it? When I described each of those sets of institutional changes, I tried to point out how the conception of each of them involves an attack, is premised on an attack, on a rejection of some basic tenet of established political science and conservative statecraft. For example, just the first one. Conservative premise is politics must be either cold and institutional or hot and anti-institutional. And the whole idea of that first set of innovations is premised on a rejection of that choice. So these aren't just practical matters of institutional design. They involve a revolution in ideas, in a way of thinking about politics. That's the point. And there's no way of circumventing the idea element. Because if we don't have this change in the ideas, we can't escape the gravitational field of the current options. There's this connection between the practical matters of institutional design and the intellectual revolution. Yes?
To some extent, all these sets of innovations also are linked to everything.
Louder, please. Yes.
All these sets of innovations are linked to what the populists propose and suggest today. So how do you make a difference between the sets of innovations?
No, I don't think they're linked. I think so. This, how are we to understand populism? First, let me make a point about nomenclature. So, the good old American conception of populism was totally different from this fancy European conception that has now been imported into the United States. So, the good old American conception of populism was populism means defending the interests of the populace, of the people. It just meant that, against the interests of the moneyed classes and the elites. Then the European conception of populism, the elitist European conception of populism, has another connotation. Populism is the establishment of a direct relation of the political leaders claiming to speak in the name of the majority, with the majority, against the institutions or circumventing the institutions. That's one of the connotations of this elitist European conception of populism. And the second connotation, related to the first, is that the Caesaristic strongman is promising the sky to the masses, and promising in the form of solutions which are also not feasible, not real, in some sense mendacious or false, because they don't have a structural content. So this elitist European conception of populism has now been imported into the United States. And if you now read the American newspapers, the Americans seem to have changed their understanding of what populism means, or to be confused about the use of their terms. And it is it's a remarkable event. Only extreme disorientation or anxiety could explain that the American elites would take the meaning of their words from the Europeans, which they've never done before. So on this understanding, that fancy European understanding of populism, populism in both those connotations that I described is a kind of liquefaction. So it's like it's an evasion of the imperative of structural change. As politics, it circumvents the constitutional arrangements or undermines them. And as policy, it promises what it can't deliver, because it has no institutional content. So these proposals that I made, the 5 proposals, have a similarity with populism, only that they are motivated by the same problems that trigger populism. But unlike populism, they do have an institutional content. So they're not about the circumvention of structure, they're about the reshaping of structure. And so that's the whole point of enumerating these 5 sets of institutional arrangements. I mean, just take the narrow constitutional point. It's a remarkable fact. If you take the contemporary populism, the contemporary right-wing populism. On the whole, it has no constitutional program other than an indistinct, vague strengthening of executive authority. In the interwar period in Europe, in the period between the two world wars, it had something of a constitutional program, focused, for example, on extending the so-called right of exception, the emergency situations. But even that was a kind of anti-institutional institutionalism, because what it said was that in certain situations, the normal legal and constitutional procedures would be suspended. There'd be a kind of vacuum in which the leader could move more freely. So again, this opposition between action and structure, which is at the heart of this idea of populism. Yes? Yeah. So the state has to be mastered and reshaped also. So you're right to point out this problem. Let me give it a positive spin, because I don't see it as simply a problem of resistance. The problem is that a deepened democracy, a high-energy democracy, should not be understood to be the opposite of an organized state. So it needs a state. And among other things, it needs a bureaucratic apparatus. So now, if you look around the world, and especially taking in mind the situation of emerging economies, developing countries, see, the problem is that an objection to, one of the many objections to an alternative like the one that I've been exploring in this course, is the progressive could say, the state capable of implementing this alternative doesn't exist, because the existing state is incapable of implementing it. And that's true. So, the state capable of implementing a project like this has to be created along the way. And we have to be careful of this mistake that reformist elites sometimes make, which is they think the reform of the state is an antecedent condition. It's an a priori, it comes before. Let's reform the state, let's reform politics, and then we'll decide what to do with the state and what to do with politics. It never happens that way in history. Never. No state reforms, no country reforms its state and reforms its politics in order later to decide what to do with the reformed state or the reformed politics. The reform of the state and the reform of politics happen only in the midst of the struggle to reorient the social and economic direction. And then you create the state that you need, when you need it, and not a moment before. That's what really happens. And then from this perspective, we see that there are, in fact, three agendas of the construction of the state in the world. And they are associated with three different centuries. So there is a 19th century agenda of the meritocratic civil service, the professional bureaucracy, which in most countries in the world has not been implemented adequately and fully to this day. So the 19th century project remains unfinished in a large part of the world. So that's the first agenda. Then there's the second agenda associated with the 20th century of administrative efficiency, requiring benchmarks and assessments of performance internal to the state and external to the state. And that understanding of administrative efficiency can't be the same today that it was in the period of Fordist mass production. So we have to have a different understanding, and the understanding can't be a mechanical transposition of efficiency in the management of private businesses to the management of the state. It's not the same thing to run a state and to run a firm. Now then comes the third agenda. The third agenda is the 21st century agenda of experimentalism. So that's the agenda that would become increasingly important in the 21st century. And so here are two examples of what it means drawn from what we've discussed in the course. So one example is the provision of public services. It shouldn't just be administrative Fordism, the provision of standardized low-quality services by the bureaucratic apparatus of the state. The state should provide the universal minimum, but the state should then engage civil society, not for profit, to partner with the state in the experimental and competitive provision of public services. Second example has to do with the form of law, of public law. So a basic characteristic of our understanding of the rule of law is that the state can operate only universally. So if it's going to have a set of rules, the rules have to apply universally to the whole society. But that's incompatible with experimentalism. The state should be able to try things out under certain conditions in particular parts of the country or particular areas of social life before it universalizes the solutions. And that would be another interpretation of what experimentalism means in the procedures of the state. So we would then not have in the state administrative Fordism. We would have the administrative counterpart to the knowledge economy. And that's the vanguard, that's the frontier in public administration today. So we have these three agendas associated with these three different centuries. And the problem is this: we can't understand them as to be implemented successively in a linear form. In other words, first finish the 19th century project, then go on to the 20th century, then the 21st. It can't be like that. They have to be implemented simultaneously, even if they are implemented piecemeal in little steps, accretively, and they will shape each other. So this is a whole other project, and you were right to point out that it was missing in this account. So the counterpart to this idea of high energy democracy is the project of the construction of the state. You need a state, and you need a state that can be formed by the cumulative implementation of these three agendas. Yes?
You mentioned the need for a revolution in ideas.
Yes.
When you take all this change in the current world, which has dominant existing ideologies, how do you recommend best to engage with it? Is it, trying to take it on their terms and then trying to bend the current, proposed ideas and find a way to connect it? Or do you sort of take a less compromising approach and sort of, set the own language, but at the cost of, either past each other or just being a more marginalized kind of language that is rejected by the
Well, this is a very complicated question, right? So this is a question which anticipates one of the conversations I want us to have about agency and the understanding of interest and ideals. So I'll just make a couple of remarks anticipating that conversation. So One is something that I already argued earlier in the course, that there's always a duality in the way of defining and defending a group interest or a class interest. So I gave the example of how you define and defend the interests of the traditional organized working class headquartered in declining Fordist mass production industry. So you can say its interest is to dig itself into its present niche in the production system against all comers, against all threats, and to buy a few more years for this form of industrial organization. So subsidies, protection, restraints on migration, then the enemies are the ones closest in the social space, the temporary workers, the small business class, and so forth. Has the advantage of tangibility, but has no future. It's a losing game. But there's always another way of defining and defending the group interest, which is institutionally transformative and socially solidaristic. So then you say, this way of defending the interests of the traditional organized industrial working class has no prospect. We have to convert mass production into something else. We have to bring it closer to the knowledge economy. In that project, the groups that we considered our adversaries have to be our allies. And so it's a different way of defining and defending the group interest. I pointed out that this is the opposite of the Marxist approach to the defense of class interest. Because the essence of the Marxist approach is that the greater the scope and the intensity of class conflict, the more the objective content of the class interest becomes manifest. So classes have an objective interest. They can be deluded about their interests, and then political defeat will be the price of their delusion. But it has an objective content. The view that I just stated is the opposite view, which is that the more conflict escalates, intensity and scope, the less possible it is to distinguish the question, what are my interests as a member of a certain class, from the question, what are the alternatives? And who would I become, and what would my interests be under those alternatives? So it turns this Marxist idea on its head, and it says the notion that interests are objective is and have a fixed content is an illusion based on stagnation. And the more that the institutional foundations are shaken, the less basis there is for this illusion. So all of this could be seen as an elaboration of David Hume's remark that people fight for their interests, but what their interests are is a matter of opinion. But it's opinion about the possible and not just about the desirable. So that's one element. Now I'll add this other element, that in transformative politics, responding directly to your question, it's necessary to meet people on their own terms and to provide them with a bridge that allows them to reinterpret their interests and identities in relation to something in the realm of the adjacent possible. So it says, you think it's a choice between A and B, but you're disregarding C, which has much more prospect, but requires a transformation. And that will lead you to reinterpret not only your interests, but maybe even your identity. So you have to do that. But that's never enough in the exercise of transformative politics, because there's also this other element, which is the prophetic element, the visionary element. It's an anti-vision of the future, for which the political prophet has to offer a down payment That is, he has to show something tangible in the present that can be seen as a prefigurement of that vision. And that's what's really incandescent in the language of transformation. It's this combination between the immediate and the remote, between the practical and the prophetic. That's what's necessary. And that's what changes everything. So that's the basic answer that I would give to this very important question. Now, there are two general issues that I wanted to signal, whether or not we discuss them now. One of them was brought up in one of the writing assignments to the undergraduates. So it's this problem of circularity. So one of the criteria, one of the understandings of these institutional alternatives is that they are intended to diminish the dependence of change on crisis. So in the low-energy democracies that exist in the world, the rule is no trauma, no transformation. And so we want the impulse to transformation, the possibility of transformation, to be in some sense made endogenous to political life and less dependent on these external shocks. But then you can make the following objection, if it is an objection. And I don't know whether it is an objection or not, but if it's not an objection, it is at least a difficulty. And it is that the introduction of the institutional arrangements that would diminish the dependence of change on crisis itself seems to depend on crisis. So how do you break this, what seems to be this vicious circle? So that's the problem. That's the difficulty. And would someone like to comment on that difficulty? So you can imagine a series of responses. So one response is say, well, crises will arise. Be sure you use the crisis as an opportunity to introduce arrangements that will at least marginally diminish the dependence of the next change on the next crisis. That would be one kind of response. And another kind of response would be to say, it's the role of the imagination. It's what we were just speaking about, the prophetic element in politics and the relation between the prophetic and the practical. What is the role of the imagination in politics? One role of the imagination in politics is to do the work of crisis without crisis. So in other words, the imagination, as it were, evens the scales, because the alternative seems to be intangible. It doesn't have this advantage of being in our grasp. And somehow the imagination in politics has to compensate for that by giving presence, potency, valence to this alternative that is not immediately within our reach. Yes?
I was thinking that maybe it helps to replace the word crisis with critical junctures, moments in history where decisions that can be taken by collective agency or government might shape differently the outcome of future trajectories. Because crisis, in a way, is inherent to history. That I cannot imagine a future in which crisis, the future is linear.
Yes.
Critical junctures are maybe more often to
Well, they're related. I see your point. So it's connected to this other concept that I evoked of the path of least resistance. So remember, there's some set of innovations in the world, like technological innovations, for example, organizational innovations. And the tendency will be for them to be adopted in the form that is least subversive of the ruling interests and the dominant ideas. So the insular knowledge economy is an example of that. It's a typical example of an outcome of the path of least resistance. And then we would recognize the path of least resistance is always the most probable outcome, always, almost by definition. But the path of least resistance is not the necessary outcome. There's an alternative to the path of least resistance. And so in the contest, this goes back to the conversation we were just having about meeting people. In the contest between the path of least resistance and the alternative to it, the defenders of the path of least resistance have a huge advantage, which is that they're referring to something that's tangible and that is shaping the dominant understanding of interests and identities. But the opponents of the path of least resistance have something going for them other than just imagination. What they have going for them is that characteristically, the path of least resistance fails fully to tap the potential of those innovations. So again, it's a very clear example of the knowledge economy. The insular knowledge economy, by a very long distance, fails to tap the potential of the knowledge economy, including its potential for economic growth, for the enhancement of productivity. So you say, look, this insular knowledge economy, it is accommodated to the established interest, but it has failed to produce a sustained rise in productivity. So then the economists like Robert Solow can come and say, the computer revolution can be found everywhere except in the productivity statistics. So it has a consequence. And that's then the advantage in what you were calling these points of inflection, that the opponents of the path of least resistance have in what is admittedly a very uneven struggle. Now, the other general idea that I wanted to mention also came up last week at the very end of class, which is the assumption about the range, the scope, the intensity of a human life. So I said in a straightforward way, an objection to this, not just to these political proposals, but to all the proposals I've been exploring in the course, is the notion that it's natural to be little. Littleness is natural. And so the fundamental vision of politics in this is greatness. So, and let's become bigger together. And the inner voice says, but what's wrong with being little? So how are we to approach that? So this is the conception of who we are, of our vocation. And it's a confounding and deep problem. So if I go back to the very beginning of the discussion of politics, remember Benjamin Constant's contrast between the ancient and the modern republic. And I said, I'm rejecting the fantasy of the ancient republic. I'm taking the position of the modern republic. the real flesh and bones, interest-bearing, interest-pursuing individual who will not be a selfless citizen, for whom political life will always be an exceptional activity. And that's the point of departure. That's the only real point of departure. And in that view, then, the basis is this notion that we remember this contrast between two classes of moves. The ordinary moves we make within a framework of arrangements and assumptions we take for granted. And the extraordinary moves, by which from time to time, typically under the provocation of crisis, we challenge and change pieces of the framework. So in relation to that abstract model, the notion is, what we're imagining is not the substitution of the first set of moves by the second set of moves. What we're imagining is that the distance between these two sets of moves diminishes, so that the activity of challenging and changing the framework can arise more continuously or naturally out of the normal business of life. And we're not in the situation of taking the established structure of our world on a take it or leave it basis and awaiting the next emergency to confront that structure. Because we have a series of institutions and practices that allow us to engage the structure piecemeal, to experiment with it, to tinker with it, to revise it step by step. And so the second set of moves is brought into the first set of moves. The first set of moves expands. And so that's an idea of empowerment. That's another way to define what it means to enhance our agency, our power. That we're not in this situation of having to surrender to a world when we engage in it. We can engage in it without surrendering completely to it. We can refuse to give it the last word and insist on keeping the last word to ourselves. And that's a higher form of freedom. And so it wouldn't be just an abstract philosophical or theological dispute about greatness versus littleness. Because the idea is that this expansion of empowerment, this gradual cumulative expansion of our agency, is associated with a whole set of our moral and material interests. The development of our productive powers, with our liberation from situations of subjugation, and so forth. That would have to be the idea. But there is this problem in the existing societies. There's this spiritual background to the conflict about politics and about bigness and littleness. And I reminded you of this stunning fact. In the Second World War, the most total war in human history, rates of suicide and depression fell precipitously in all the belligerent powers. In Russia, for example, where 22 million people died, they also fell. And then as soon as universal peace was reestablished, they rose again almost instantly. What does that say about us? So it's that we need to forget about ourselves and to live for something that we think is bigger than us, and to be involved in another view, in a larger view. And we desire that. And it shouldn't be necessary to be at war to have this experience. The problems with European civilization in the 20th century. were awake when they were at war, and then in peace they fall asleep. Why can't they be both awake and at peace? And so this is the spiritual dimension in the discussion about the alternative forms of political life. So politics, when serious, has a religious character, and its central question is, who are we? And what can we become? And what is the range of our ambition? And in a sense, all of these arguments about the deepening of democracy, high energy democracy, touch on that. Would someone like to make a comment about this? Yeah. Yes? Here? Yes.
Yeah, so I wanted to, I guess, you talk about things like re-energizing federalism. You also mentioned much earlier in the class like the differences between your conception of like promoting synergy between differences in a way that is not like a shallow cosmopolitanism, I think was your exact words. But there is a degree to which the reason people want some of these things, or the reason they might be broadly popular, is profoundly negative. Like, a lot of people want re-energized federalism because it would give their state more opportunity to discriminate, or like that's always what
Yes.
states' rights has been go for. Or in cases where you say you need a certain mass of people's interests, like this is the clearest example of this is in healthcare, but you need like a big enough mass of people's interests together to make like a universal healthcare program workable. And there are a decent number of states that don't want that, not because it would or wouldn't help their citizens, but because they are responding to other powerful forces, and they would undermine it by having their states be diminuting from the federal initiative. You might also think that like a lot of these states like if they are trying to maintain traditional hierarchies,
Yes.
take specific action in part of their experimental power,
Yes.
specifically to make the lives of people who are already poor and already vulnerable more precarious, such that they have less time and energy to engage with the political structures that are kind of allying against them.
Yes.
A large part of this experimentalism makes the system very vulnerable to a kind of, it's not even necessarily hot or cold politics. Some of these are totally anti-populist.
Yes.
Very toxic politics nonetheless.
Yes.
So how do you deal with that without making a standard of experimentalism that says a standard for which states can say, I want to experiment with such and such, that isn't just like being in which we're not praying that like enlightened people are going to be accepting or rejecting that on the federal level.
Yes. So you're speaking out of the experience of American history. And first I want to point out that from the early 20th century on, the rise of the progressivist movement in the early 20th century, the progressives associated themselves with strong federal power against states' rights. But of course, in a much earlier period of American history, it was the opposite. So the Hamiltonian project was the project of the plutocratic elites in the early formation of the Republic, and it was associated with strong federal government, and the resistance to strong federal power was the popular resistance. So in different countries, this association of the central with the anti-central has been contingent and has been subject to dramatic reversals. Now, then there's the substantive question of whether this experimentalism, whether or how it should be qualified. And of course, when I describe this, I argue it should be qualified. So the strongest case is in that situation of extreme divergence in which a state applies for a right of very wide divergence. And then I said there have to be two kinds of checks. So first, it has to be approved by the representative institutions, the two political branches of government. There has to be a majority or a supermajority to condone this right of wide divergence. But independently of the political check, there has to be a judicial check. And the judicial check has to take the form of ensuring, in direct response to your concern, that the divergence from the general solutions not be for the purpose of entrenching the privileges of a faction of the population against others. And that's, American law is full of the development of such standards. That's how the law of due process and of equal protection in American constitutional law has developed. The jurists and the judges have developed intermediate standards to make those kinds of discriminations. So I would say that, and that this is a bet on the potential of democratic experimentalism, but it shouldn't be a blind bet. It should be a bet subject to checks and qualifications. But the fear that could go off the rails, that could result in abuse, should not result in the suppression of experimentalism, because then we're losing the higher value. But we should deal with this risk that you properly point to by developing the series of political and judicial checks.
Like the problem is that like I take a little bit of issue with the history of two of your examples.
Yes.
In that the Hamiltonian versus like Jeffersonian split was not in any way like a popular versus elite.
Well, it wasn't, I wouldn't say it was just Jeffersonian. So the United States in the early decades of the Republic was a class of smallholders. The vast majority of men were either slaves or self-employed. 4 out of every 5 white men were self-employed. They didn't work for another. And they were suspicious, hostile to strong federal power. So that was the form that the popular interest took then. It's not the form that it took after vast economic aggregation. They were hostile, a large part of them, to the Hamiltonian Project. And the Hamiltonian Project was the project of the of the nascent plutocracy and the nation-building elite of the United States. It created devices like the organization of the public debt and the National Bank of the United States, and the popular interest continued hostile to those devices and succeeded in the presidency of Andrew Jackson of dissolving the National Bank. So this was a real conflict.
I guess like in this case, and maybe this is something that I write about in the paper, but it strikes me that we are having a very limited view of like who is part of the populace when we say that. Like you are certainly correct when you say that most white people were
Yes.
self-employed. That is, I think, unfairly discounting the numerous enslaved Africans.
No, I said that. Most men were either slaves or self-employed. The reality was, so the contest between those two elements in the free population was orthogonal to the issue of slavery, right? It wasn't that either of them were anti-slave. That was a problem that became manifest later.
No. One of the big reasons that they were opposed to federal government was because they thought that it was going to be like a mechanism that would end up slavery. Like, this is fairly well documented. Hamilton was a manumissionist, among other things.
Yeah.
The Federalist Party, while not specifically anti-slavery, was
because of nascent industry and so forth. Yeah, but all right. But I was without entering into this historiographic dispute. My point was simply that the relation of leftists or progressives to centralism versus anti-centralism has differed greatly in American history, and was only much later in American history that there was this consolidation of the connection between the progressives and strong federal power.
I really don't think that you can transplant the idea of progressivism or even necessarily populism onto like anti-federalist sentiment. I think that that's
Populism was different because the populists often had strong positions in the states, the agrarian populists, for example. But so it was really the main champions of strong central government were the progressives. So the two Roosevelts and the whole movement that they sponsored. So this fundamental, or to go back to another contrast between two traditions of reform in the United States, broadly conceived. One tradition is defend the little guy against the big one. And the other tradition is accept that the big one will have the commanding heights of the economy, of the production system, but subject those big firms to strong regulatory power by the federal government, which was one of the main concerns of the progressive movement at the start of the 20th century, and associated ever since with the progressives, who have been friends of federal power. I think this is a very dangerous association. I think it's a contingent association. It was a misfortune of the American progressives to become enemies of experimentation in the states, and to treat that accidental historical connection as if it were something permanent and rational and necessary. A big mistake, and it's part of the background to the subsequent rise of populism. The association of the leftists with the central bureaucracy in Washington, the opposition to what goes on in the country. These cards have to be shuffled, and but that would be a dispute that we'd have to have in the context of arguments about the United States and American politics and American history. But I see your point there. Yes?
So, Professor, I'm thinking about your definition of European populism.
Yes.
So, it seems like this populist narrative, at least in Latin America, I'm thinking recently Mexico or during the Pink Wave, is voicing a need for change that cannot be done using institutions. Because at some point, institutions in quite sophisticated democracies have become the guardians of the status quo and the guardians of the interest of the elite.
Yes.
So I'm having trouble understanding how we're going to be capable of making use of the families of innovation that you are describing on situations where institutions are not flexible enough or are not receptive enough for changes of the magnitude that would require.
It's creating the institutional arrangements that are appropriate to this. Let me take your example of Latin America. So one thing that was common in a large part of Latin America was the imitation of American-style presidential regimes and American-style federalism. So what happens when this Madisonian scheme is translated into a situation in which there are vast inequalities, as in Latin America, and political forces determined to act on those inequalities, sincerely or insincerely. So we have this situation in which the president is elected promising the sky to the masses because there's direct election. It's the only election in the system in which it's possible for a political force to march directly to the center of power. So it has a huge advantage. Now, in many Latin American countries, the elites have been concerned to replace the presidential system by a parliamentary regime. And why? Because every 4 or 5 years, they have an anxiety attack that some irresponsible outsider could win power. Irresponsible meaning not accountable to them. Huh? So they say, let's stop this. Let's have a parliamentary regime. There'll be these political parties with their oligarchies controlled by money, and we'll be able to influence them. So that's not the solution, because that's like putting the cover on the cauldron. The premature adoption of a European-style pure parliamentary regime in those circumstances would have the effect of delivering power to the elites. But the presidential regime, copied from the United States, then creates this impasse, because the leader is elected promising everything to the masses. He arrives in power, and he discovers that he's in a system in which he has great power to favor or disfavor interests, but almost no power to transform anything. Because the whole system was designed by Madison to establish this table of correspondences between the transformative reach of a political project and the severity of the constitutional obstacles that it has to overcome. And Madison designed the system deliberately to perpetuate the impasses. So the impasse continues. So what's the solution? The solution in the short run is to equip the regime with instruments for the rapid resolution of impasse. So there's an impasse between the directly elected president and the Congress. Either of them can call anticipated elections, or either of them can stage a comprehensive programmatic plebiscite. So that's a relatively modest constitutional innovation. But it totally alters the character of the Madisonian machine, because it transforms the regime into a machine for the acceleration of politics. Exactly the opposite of what the architects of the American constitutional system designed. So that's an example of how relatively modest constitutional innovations can produce large political effects. So that system was not designed for a society that is incandescent, that is struggling with these extreme inequalities and exclusions, because it excites popular mobilization, for example, through the direct election of the president, but then it frustrates the result of the mobilization in the constitutional form. So fix the constitutional form. That's the solution. So this is the element of originality in the constitutional design that would change the direction. Now, why haven't we been capable of doing that?
Well, because any movement in that direction is immediately point as anti-democratic, because it's empowering the president to follow his own agenda without checks and balances.
No, but it's not. But that's the point. This is part of the confusion in the American constitutional debate. It's a confusion between this liberal fragmentation of power and the conservative slowing down of politics. So I'm not saying concentrate power in the presidency. That would be Caesarism. I'm saying create many centers of power, but create constitutional mechanisms to resolve impasse when impasse arises, rather than perpetuating the impasse. And that changes the logic of the system. Of course, it wouldn't be enough, because then you have to have the other things that I described in the other sets of innovations, the heightening of the level of organized political engagement, the relation of money to politics, the relation of politics to media, the use of the federal system to experiment with alternatives and so forth, all of those other things. But this specific element of constitutional design is immensely important. Now, let me go back to the American arrangements, because they highlight another aspect of this problem of constitutional design. So, in the United States, the dominant way of changing the Constitution has been to pretend that it means something different. So there's an amendment procedure, you know, but the amendment procedure is very hard to implement. And the Constitution is sacrosanct. It's part of the national identity. And so, but the Americans then discovered another way to change the Constitution, which is to say it means something different. But there's a consequence which is not appreciated of this pretense. So it's relatively easy to pretend that the Constitution means something different or new when the object of constitutional interpretation are the rights, like equal protection or due process, because then you can create new rights, you can reinterpret what they mean and so forth. But how can you pretend that the Constitution says that there should be 5 branches of government when it says that there should be 3 branches of government? You can't do that. So the predisposition to change the Constitution by reinterpreting it rather than by changing it has as its consequence a bias against structural change in the setup of the government and in favor of the reinterpretation of rights. So now transpose that to Latin America, and then you get what I just described. So you have these frustrated Caesars elected to power, promising everything to the masses in a system which is designed to cut their arms off as soon as they arrive in the presidential palace. And creating this frustration in which either they then bow down to the elites or they begin to agitate against the Republican institutions. So that's one side of it. The other side of it is they then begin to inflate these promises of rights. So the constitutions are then filled up with 100 rights to everything. By this form of the constitutional imagination that translates or replaces structural change in the constitutional architecture by promises of rights. Useless, because they're vain promises. There's no institutional machinery or legal machinery to implement these promises. So you have to get rid of that way of doing things. So this is an invitation to constitutional invention. And it's one of the many things we haven't had. And so the result is it's a calamity. So I think what this conversation that we're just having is an antidote to a danger that we should guard ourselves against, which is imagining that all of this is like some discussion of some big faraway system that would require some revolutionary change. It has pieces in it. And these pieces are subject to marginal transformations that may seem to be very modest in their content, but they could have very far-reaching consequences. because this is one of the things that the original constitutional theoreticians of the 18th and early 19th century discovered, that these modest constitutional changes can have far-reaching political effects, like the example I just gave. You equip the American regime, presidential regime, with devices for the rapid resolution of impasse. It was designed to perpetuate those impasses. Now you create a machinery to overcome the impasses. You turn the system upside down. You completely change its political direction by a set of very specific constitutional innovations. So this fact should encourage us to understand that we're not dealing with some monolithic wall. We can take it apart in pieces. And there are certain initiatives that are then wedges that change the political direction. Well, let me at least begin then the discussion of education and just outline it in the broadest outlines. And in a sense, it's linked to what I see as the main theme in this political constitutional debate. The main theme is the enhancement of agency, the capacity for transformation. So education is to form the capable worker and citizen who is capable of exercising this agency. And it's part of what we could call a social inheritance. So this package of vital protected interests and capability ensuring endowments. So then there's this fundamental contrast between two attitudes to protection. So one thing is to say protection is the end in itself. That's the dominant attitude of the progressives today. Protect against insecurity, especially economic insecurity. The other view is we protect so that the protected agent can go out into the storm. So protection is for the sake of empowerment rather than being an end in itself. And we open society up to a radicalized plasticity and experimentation, and we create this shield so that the individual can be unafraid and capable in the midst of this intensified experimentation. And then we have, with respect to education, so education is a vital part of that social inheritance. And there is this unique problem about education, which touches on one of the deepest aspects of this idea of freedom. So traditionally, there are two great powers in the world that attempt to control education: the family and the state. The family says to the child, become like me. The family or the community as an extension of the family. And the state says to the child, serve me. And it wants someone who's useful in the present order. And the higher ideal of education is that the school would be the voice of the future. And the central ambiguity in education is that it is to render someone more capable in the world that exists, but also to empower him to change that world, to resist it, to be bigger than it. And how is that to happen? So somehow the school, the educational system, has to be able to throw these powers of the family and the state against each other and to open up a space in which the school can have this higher vocation. So the school needs to render the individual capable, but the school also has to see in the child the tongue-tied prophet and give access to distant experience, the equipment of resistance. Now, then we can distinguish two tasks. So, one task has to do with the institutional and economic setting for education, especially in countries that are large, unequal, and federal in structure, or involving some coexistence of central and local authorities, like the United States or like Brazil. So there the task is to reconcile the local management of the schools by states and municipalities with national standards of investment and quality. In order to implement a central principle. The principle is the quality of the education that a young person receives should not depend on the happenstance of where or to whom the child is born. Now, to reconcile national standards of investment and quality with local management, we need three instruments. So the first instrument is a machinery of assessment of performance to discover what works and what doesn't work and how it works or how it fails to work. The second instrument is a mechanism to redistribute resources and even staff from richer places to poorer places. So a practical implication is the school system cannot depend solely or primarily on local finance, as it does in the United States. That's impossible, because that will echo the underlying inequalities. The third instrument is there has to be some corrective procedure. What happens if, despite all efforts, including efforts at redistribution, a local school system persistently falls beneath the minimum acceptable standard of quality? We can't just say, well, that's too bad for those young people. There has to be a procedure to correct. So we could imagine that in a federal system, it wouldn't be a federal intervention, an intervention by the federal government. There would be some arrangement associating the three levels of the federation in common bodies, let's call them trans-federal, that would be able to take over a local failing school system, delegate its management or reform temporarily to independent administrators, fix it, and return it fixed. Now, in the United States, to some limited extent, as in the example of complex enforcement, the federal judiciary has already done that. So we already have examples in the somewhat inappropriate form of judicial intervention of these corrective procedures. So let's say that's one task. Now comes the second task. The second task has to do with the pedagogic paradigm, the way of teaching and learning. And the way of teaching and learning that is required for a disseminated and deepened knowledge economy, for a high energy democracy, and more generally for the enhancement of agency. So what is this kind of education? And I suggested a view of it earlier in 4 aspects. So first, it has to give priority to the analytic and synthetic capabilities of the mind against the background of a view of the mind. The mind is not, one aspect is like a machine, modular and formulaic. In another aspect, the mind is not like a machine. It's not modular and formulaic. It can combine everything with everything else, and it can transgress its own methods and presuppositions and make sense of its discoveries retrospectively, formulating after the fact the methods and presuppositions and make sense of them. That's what we call the imagination. And it's this second side of the mind that should be our greatest concern, and its characteristic powers of analysis and synthesis. Now, second, these powers are always acquired in dealing with particular content. They're not acquired in a vacuum of content. But what matters with respect to content is not superficial encyclopedic coverage. It's selective depth. So then on this view, education should be directed to themes or to projects as the occasion, as the setting for the mastery of these capabilities. The third characteristic is that as much as possible it should be cooperative, as advanced science is, in cooperation among students, among teachers, among schools, rather than juxtaposing individualism and authoritarianism. And the fourth characteristic is that it should be dialectical. It should approach every subject from contrasting points of view, and it should not do what in general the national curriculums in the world do, which is to infantilize the orthodoxies of the university culture and their forced marriages of method and subject matter. Teach fundamental physics by an anti-historical method, teach the life sciences by a historical method, teach economics as a study of the method developed by the marginalist theoreticians at the end of the 19th century, simplified in the economic textbooks and so forth. It shouldn't do that, because that induces the young to mistake the dominant ideas for the way things are. So every subject should be taught at least twice from contrasting points of view. And if we sacrifice the interest in encyclopedic coverage, we'll have time to do that. Now, this idea of education applies to both general education and technical education. So, traditional view of education is there's general education for the elites and technical training for the masses in the European countries, for example. But now we think of it as a continuum, because the technical education that's pertinent in these circumstances is not the old German model of vocational training, focused on job-specific and machine-specific skills. You teach people to be an electrician, to be a plumber, to operate metal-cutting lathes, and so forth. It's focused on higher-order practical and conceptual capabilities, such as the capabilities needed to operate numerically controlled machine tools. And those capabilities are on a continuum with the kind of general education that I've just described. Now, who's going to do this in a real complicated country? It can't be done by a small clique of despotic visionaries, there has to be a pedagogic vanguard of hundreds and thousands of teachers and activists who become co-authors of a project like this one. And the project in its fuller development has to be not just for original education, that is the education of the young, but it has to also allow for these changes of direction of adults in the course of their lives. So the state has to have provisions that help people change direction and reinvent themselves, change careers, learn new skills, so that the whole nation becomes a nation of experimentalists. So this is a project of national liberation. It's one of the great formative projects that we can imagine, I want to argue, in the contemporary world. And it can be understood in relation to those political and economic alternatives, but it can also be justified, be argued directly for the sake of this enhancement of agency, this creation of the capable, empowered, and transcendent individual. And it seems to me it has immense appeal in these societies because it's I've stated it very dogmatically and succinctly, but it can be translated into a language that anyone can understand. And it has this promise of empowering, liberating the ordinary man and woman and changing his life chances. And it seems to hold a special promise to sustain this prophetic element in the discourse of transformative politics. So we do have a few moments, and to discuss some aspect of this. I don't know whether it seems to you that this project is very remote from contemporary debates and experiments. I see it myself as being a continuation of the debates and proposals of some of the major educational reformers in the contemporary world. For example, in the American context, it could be seen as an extension, a radicalization of John Dewey's program. And John Dewey was the major educational reformer in the United States. It seems to me that it comes to life, it acquires a greater weight when it's connected with the contest over economic and political alternatives. Because, again, you could say, those alternatives that we've discussed require a certain kind of person, a person with these powers, the powers sustained by this type of education. What do you think the greatest weakness of this educational project is? Yes?
The way we have defined science. Because today on social sciences, there is a limit to what we consider scientific. And some of the most important topics of a progressive agenda are very difficult to measure. So it would be very hard to introduce a curricula that would have the same standards of science in both sides of the classes.
Well, it's interesting because the teaching of science in secondary education is an enigma in the world. My impression is that it's one of the most backward areas of education because my impression, my observation, certainly in my own country, observing the teaching of science in secondary education is that many of the people who teach, whom I observed, view nature as an accumulation of a grab bag of curious particular facts, paradoxically governed by immutable and universal laws. And so it's like the ontology of Aristotle and the science of Newton. And their view of science is militantly anti-theoretical. So it's a mystery how a young person develops a scientific vocation and crosses this desert so hostile to the theoretical imagination to become a scientist. And so we have to change. Yes?
Well, I mean, to the larger point, I feel like maybe I'm a little too mired in the actual implementation of these ideas
Yes.
in the Boston school district
Yes?
to have a broad perspective. So, but anyway, going to the point about science, I mean, notwithstanding that maybe it's not nowhere near optimal in any situation, but even sort of pushing toward the most optimal it could be, I feel there's kind of a, so my girlfriend is a teacher and she teaches math and science, and I'm a PhD student doing science.
Yes.
And so, you know, so we're always sort of discussing, like my life is very creative and it involves
Yes.
this kind of empowerment and liberation of my spirit. But at the same time, we were thinking about how all of that happens on a bedrock of like extreme technical knowledge, and that's the foundation on which that type of thinking is
Yes.
built. And if you sort of ask a group of students, you know, well, you do the experiment today, you're going to figure out how it works. It's actually completely pointless unless they
No, of course, that's not it. Of course, that's not it. That's not it. But the particular point that I was focusing on was the ladder of abstraction.